you can't just sit around here and talk about, well, what do you want to do? You need to get out and do it. And and what I've learned over the 23 years of in water mission is it you don't get it right every time. But that shouldn't stop you from doing it.
George, thanks so much. Excited to talk to you today. And I think it's always helpful if you'll just kind of jump in and tell a little bit about your professional background and kind of how that's led you to do some of the charitable stuff you're doing today. I think that would give some great perspective as part of your story.
My background is chemical engineering. I went to undergraduate school at the University of Florida and was really interested in biomedical engineering. This is back in the late 60s, and decided to go into graduate school. And there were two schools that had biomedical engineering combined with chemical. And one of them was Columbia University in New York. So I ended up at Columbia doing a master's degree. And then I went out and worked in research for a year in Boston and decided that I really wanted to go on and pursue my PhD. So I was still interested in biomedical engineering, but more in a new field of engineering, and where we were using computers to model and simulate processes. And there were, again, two schools that had programs in the chemical engineering department for that. And one was Tulane. And so that's how I ended up at Tulane. And while I was at Tulane working on my PhD, I really was drawn more to the computer modeling of chemical processes, and so my career in engineering began really in the chemical process industry. So while I was at Tulane, I met my wife Molly, and Molly was from Tupelo, Mississippi, and she'd just graduated from undergraduate school and was teaching school and in New Orleans. And we met at a Christmas party. I tell people, for me, it was love at first sight. It took Molly a couple of weeks to get to the point where she was on the same page with me. But we were married. We met in December, and we got married in July. And I should backtrack just a little bit. Both Molly and I grew up in Christian families, but I didn't know. I think neither one of us really knew that we could have a personal relationship with Jesus. We didn't grow up understanding that, and so when we met in New Orleans, neither one of us were walking with the Lord. And there's no doubt in my mind the Lord brought us together because He redeemed that relationship. But and it was never a time when, if you'd ever asked me, "Are you a Christian?" I would have always said, "Of course I am." But I didn't realize, I didn't know what I didn't know. So anyway, we were married. I finished school at Tulane, and my first job was with a German engineering company in Germany. And we both wanted to live in Europe, and Molly had studied a year in Madrid. And so we ended up moving to Germany, and we lived there for 3 years, working for a German engineering company. And they transferred us back to the United States. And our first child was born in Germany, our daughter. We moved back, lived in New Jersey, and after a little bit, maybe 2 years, I left the German company and went to work for Exxon Research and Engineering, and that was just an incredible job. If you were a chemical engineer back in those days, that's where you wanted to work. That was just the cream of the job opportunities for chemical engineers was Exxon. And I had a great career path. And our second son was our second child, who was a son, George IV, was born in New Jersey while we were working for Exxon. And one day, just out of the blue, Molly said, we both grew up in a church. Maybe we ought to find a church to go to so we could bring their kids up in a church. And I said, that sounds fine to me. And our next door neighbor actually recommended an Episcopal church that was in the area. And so we started going to this Episcopal church, and that's where we were nurtured into a faith. That's where I learned that I could have a personal relationship with Jesus. So I don't remember exact dates, but I was about 35 years old when I actually learned that I could have a personal relationship with Jesus. And so our faith, the beauty of that whole experience was that Molly and I grew together in our faith. It wasn't that one was praying for the other. We were praying for each other and growing together. And God, that really played a big role, I think, in later years because we matured together. So it was the late 90s. I'm sorry, late 70s. I don't know if I'd had a bad day at work or what, but I remember sitting at the dinner table and saying, I might like to go do something on my own. And one of the beautiful things about Molly was that I cannot remember a time when I would come up with a harebrained idea and she would say, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. She was always supportive and encouraging. So it developed over a number of years from that casual comment that I might like to go do something on my own to eventually in 1981 leaving my job at Exxon, and we moved our family to Charleston and started an environmental consulting business. I would say that I grew up in a small family business, and Molly also grew up in a small family business. And Exxon, while it was a great career path, the career path was you spent 2 years in the office designing a refinery, and then you spent 2 years in the field building it and starting it up. And so it was 2 years at home and then 2 years traveling. And I had the opportunity to see families that had taken that career path and their kids saw the world. They saw a lot of different cultures, but they had no roots. And since we had both grown up in the South in small towns, we really wanted our kids to have a place where they could call home, and that was one of the strong reasons for deciding to leave Exxon. And and really start doing something that neither one of us had a clue about. I did. I think I should say that I had a wonderful safety net. The people at Exxon told me, "Hey, if this doesn't work out, come on back. You got a place here." So really, it was low risk. Um, but we started. I call it an environmental consulting firm. It was actually a testing laboratory, but because of my engineering background, we included engineering in the business. So it was both testing and engineering consulting. And it turns out that was a really great combination. None of our competitors combined the two because they're very different kinds of businesses. And um, but when we started the company, our aspiration was to grow a small family business, just like my parents had done and Molly's parents had done, and raise our kids and have a good life. This was 1981. What we didn't realize was that the environmental regulations were just beginning to be enforced in the early 80s. And um, I think the other thing that really put us in a position for being where I am today is the decision to start that business came after 4 years of prayer and talking about it. And I remember a cold February night lying in bed in New Jersey and saying, "Lord, I need to know, I have an opportunity to go do this. I need to know, do you want me to do this?" Because I had a really good job at Exxon. And it was probably the most clear response that I can remember ever hearing from the Lord. It was just this internal clear voice that said, "George, look at all the doors I've opened for you over these last 4 years. This is what I want you to do." And so I got up the next morning and I told Molly, and the decision was made. And we moved to Charleston and started this business. That company, so because we were doing this because we felt like the Lord wanted us to do it, we said, "Okay, this company belongs to the Lord. We'll run it. It's a for-profit company, but it's God's." And you say, "Well, what does that mean?" Because you were making all the money. What it means is, honestly, I think it's just good business practice. It means treating the client like you would want to be treated, and keeping your commitments, and treating your employees like you would want to be treated. And so Molly had no technical background. She didn't have a technical bone in her body, but she was very much a people person. And in fact, the plan was not for Molly to work in the business. She was going to raise a family. And the first year we were here, we had our third child, John Christian. And so we got 3 children, but the company, I needed help. And so I said, "Molly, I need help." And so Bella, all she knew how to do was answer the phone. And I said, "Okay, all you have to do when somebody says, 'Can you help us?' is say yes." And and she could do that. And it was a wonderful experience because the environmental regulations were requiring companies. So our clients were industry, chemical industry, and the regulations were requiring chemical industry to do things that do testing for contaminants at levels that the instruments weren't capable of getting to those levels. And so generally you get a nasty letter from the government saying you're in violation of this regulation. You're summoned to a hearing, and you can bring technical and legal counsel. And so when they would call us and say, "Can you help me?" the answer was always yes. And then we would figure out how to adapt those procedures so that they still complied with EPA regulations, but they met the EPA regulations. And it put us in a competitive advantage that allowed us to experience incredible growth. So that company grew at about 40% a year for many years. I mean, 40%, you can do the math, you double every 2 years in size when you're doing that. So this little family business that we thought we're going to have a great family life, and we did have a great family life, but that little two-person operation became one of the largest labs in the country. And I can look back now and understand that was simply God preparing me for what I'm doing today. But at that point, it was just an exciting business adventure to be a part of a company that was growing at that rate. And Molly became very verse in working with clients. So she was basically business development, and I was the technical side of it. Our third child, and all of this time, we were very fortunate. Charleston, I think Charleston's a little unique. I don't know this for a fact, but I think Charleston's a little unique. There is an abundance of really good churches here in Charleston. And we got plugged into a very small Episcopal church that I remember we were pretty good. We were doing pretty good in our walk with the Lord when we moved here, but the chief pastor in an Episcopal church is called a rector, and he came to visit. First week we went, and he sat down on the couch. Came in, sat down on the couch, and the first thing he says, "Are you born again?" And, I wasn't quite used to. I knew about being born again, obviously, but I wasn't quite used to getting into those discussions at that point. But I said, "Well, yes, we are." But that church was a wonderful church, and it continued to nurture us in our faith. So one of the chief primary causes of failure of a small startup business is they're undercapitalized. And so we were very fortunate during that 4-year process to have people come along and said, God said, look at all the people that I brought along. So we were very fortunate to have people come along and tell us kind of, what do you need to do to really optimize the probability that you'll be successful? And one of those things was we sold our house in New Jersey to raise the capital to start this business. And we were prepared to live off of the savings of from selling the house for 2 years. So we didn't have to draw a salary. And it was actually about a year and a half into it when we made it. We felt like we were making enough money, so let's write ourselves a paycheck and go buy groceries. And we committed when we did that. We said when we start drawing a salary, we'll tithe. And it was painless because we went from having no income to having a little income. So take 10%, and it doesn't hurt at all. And it was just a very easy experience for us. So so companies growing at 40% a year. There's a Christian culture of caring for the staff and giving back to the community. We were building a new building every 2 years because we were growing. And in 1984, our youngest son, John Christian, so he was born in 1982. In 1984, we moved into a new house, and 2 weeks after we moved into this new house, there was a creek in the back of the house, and he drowned in the creek. And that was December the 28th. And when something like that happens to a family, I don't remember the statistics, but 70% of families fall apart. And the reason is when something like that happens, your life, you hit a dead end, and you have to make a decision. Do I turn away from God? I can't accept a God that would let this happen. Or do I say I can't get through this without God? And we were fortunate that we were far enough along in our faith that we knew we needed all the help we could get. And so it drew us into a deeper relationship with God. And he surrounded us with people who loved us and took care of us. And I think when we should all always be seeking the truth, but when you go through something like this, what you really want to know is the truth. Tell me the truth. Don't tell me something to make me feel good. Just tell me the truth. And we were blessed to have people who could speak God's truth into our lives and love us. I tell people, when John Christian died, it was like somebody kicked me in the stomach and just knocked the breath out of me. And I remember the night he died, the house was full of people. Everything was just black, but I was friends full of people, and Molly went up to bed, and I was down talking to people, and the next morning Molly woke up and she said, "I need to share something with you." She said, I had a vision last night of 4 angels coming down and picking John Christian up and taking him up into heaven. And I mean, it's so real that it wasn't, she wasn't asleep. She wasn't dreaming. It was a vision. And I think God gave that to Molly just as a way of reassuring her that John Christian was in a safe place. I later John Christian was he was full of energy, and I think it took four angels to. I don't think one angel could have handled it, so it took four to get him. Maybe there was just a big celebration. I digress. In any event, uh, it was it was a dark night, and that night lasted about a year. And during that time, God was just nurturing us and growing us in our faith. That whole time, we still had this company to run, and it's still growing at 40% a year. So that's a good thing, because it kept us occupied. And so fast forward, 1998, our daughter had graduated from college. George IV was in college, and Jenny, our daughter's name is Jenny. She was living had lived in Honduras for 2 years. She went to Honduras to teach English as a second language, and lived with her youth pastor from growing up. And she loves kids, and I felt like she could do more for the kids if she had a medical background than if she was just teaching school. So she had come back to the United States to go to the medical university here to get a degree in nurse practitioner. And her intent was to go back into some developing country. She felt at one point the Lord calling her to India, and but she was here in nursing school in early November 1998, when a Category 5 hurricane hit Honduras. That hurricane was called Hurricane Mitch. And Molly and I had gone down to visit Jenny, and while we were there, I had met an Episcopal priest of Honduras. And I was on my way back from a meeting in Atlanta. I was listening to the news. This was day 2 of the hurricane. Mitch made landfall on Honduras and Nicaragua, and then it stopped. And it just stalled, and it was torrential rain for days, and just catastrophic flooding, and washing out dikes, and bridges being washed out. Destruction was just unbelievable. And so day 2, and I'm driving back from Atlanta, and I'm listening to the news, and they estimated about 10,000 people were missing and assumed dead at that point. And I felt the Lord say, you need to do something. It wasn't as audible as that February night, but it was, you've experienced this. Hey, you need to go do something. And quite frankly, I had no interest in Honduras. I was, by this time, running a big company, and but I also knew I couldn't ignore that. So I came back to my office. Now this is '98. I don't remember when email first came out, but those are certainly the early days of email. And I sat down at my computer, and I sent the Bishop of Honduras, his name was Leo Friday, he was Cuban, and I sent him an email, said, what can we do to help? We know a little bit about water. And I pushed the send button and I said, okay, Lord, I've done my part. I tried. I gave it a good effort. I knew that Honduras didn't have any electricity uh, because the country was destroyed. And I also knew enough about Latin America to know that they don't generally respond. Even in good times, it can be months before you hear from them. And so I figured I was off the hook. I'd given it a good shot, and so came back into work the next morning, turned on my computer, and there was an email from the bishop, and it said we need 6 drinking water units. So I have a number of regrets in life. One of them is that I didn't save those 2 emails because they'd be framed on my wall now if I had them. But I printed off the email from Bishop Friday and I took it over to Molly's office. And so I think we better respond to this. So we started calling around looking for water systems, water treatment systems, and all we could find were little camper units that we knew that wasn't what they were talking about. We did find a very large system that the military uses, but they were $250,000 a piece, and we weren't going to be buying 6 of those and sending them to Honduras. So we so let's just build something and design something and build it. And our model, our design criteria was Charleston recovering from a hurricane. So when a hurricane hits here, a week, 2 weeks, we're back up on our feet. And we said, Honduras probably isn't going to respond quite so quickly. Let's build something that'll last 6 months. And sketched out on a piece of yellow paper a very basic water filtration system that was capable of treating 10 gallons of water a minute. So enough water for a small community. And we went down to local hardware stores and bought materials and started building these 6 water systems. So some interesting things happened with that. This is November, and this is the busiest time of the year for an environmental laboratory because the regulations require that data be submitted during that time of the year. And so the chemists are under a lot of pressure to meet requirements of the testing procedures. Generally, the morale is at its lowest point. When we started building these water systems, the morale went through the roof. People got excited. They'd take breaks and they'd come back and work on the water systems, and it was just a phenomenal experience. The other thing that happened was Charleston it is a pretty big city, but it has a small town feel to it. And when we started doing this, the churches started getting behind it, and the mayor got behind it, and churches really, churches in Columbia, which is about an hour and a half from here, got behind it. My brother's church in Alabama got behind it. 2 weeks after the hurricane, we ended up with 50 tons of supplies in addition to those 6 water systems. And while we're building these water systems, Molly is on the phone trying to figure out how are we going to get all this stuff down to Honduras. And I said Molly was a people person. We knew Senator Strom Thurmond, who was a senator from South Carolina at that time, and he was the chairman of the Armed Services Committee in the Senate. And so she's talking to his office, and he arranged to have a C-5 fly into Charleston, which is the Air Force's largest airplane. And we have a C-17 air base here. C-17 is a pretty big airplane, but the C-5 pilots joke that you can put a C-17 in a C-5. You can't really, but they're big. In any event, we had more supplies than could go on a C-5. And so they ended up sending another plane. I think it was a C-17 that went down also. We had 50 people from our company volunteer to go down. And we decided, we were in a meeting, we said, we're only going to take men because Honduras was dangerous at that point. The bridges were gone. There were still bodies floating in the water. And so the decision was we're only going to take men. And Molly says, well, I'm going. And so Molly was the only exception to that. And in retrospect, it was a really good thing that we took Molly because she was the only one that spoke Spanish. And we didn't think about the need to communicate, but she did. So 17 of us, 2 weeks after the hurricane, were on a C-5, and we landed at the military base in the center of the country. And half of the team went north with 3 water systems and supplies, and half went south. And we spent Thanksgiving week in Honduras setting up water systems. They told us that 3 of those water systems went into communities that didn't have water before the hurricane. Today, I know that none of those communities had safe water before the hurricane. And it was a trip that changed our lives. We were introduced to something that we had no idea about, that today I call the global water crisis. It's really interesting how God worked. Our team had gone south, and we were to rendezvous back at this military base on a certain day. Actually, it was the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. We were to rendezvous back before at the military base to come back to the U.S. And we were a little bit late getting to the gate. And while the guard at the gate was finding out who we were and getting permission to let us in, we saw our plane take off. And so we were stuck. And they let us on the base, and they said, well, here's a little pavilion with some picnic tables. You're welcome to stay on these tables tonight, and maybe there'll be another plane tomorrow. Well, there was a missionary couple that lived in the town. They found out we were there, and they invited us to Thanksgiving dinner the next day. And while we were there, we met a Catholic priest who had an orphanage up in the mountains not far from this little village. And the orphanage had been washed down the hill, and he had received no supplies, no relief. We're sitting over there with all these supplies on the tarmac of the Navy at the Air Force Base. And so we arranged to have a 40-foot container filled up with building supplies and blankets and stuff, and went up the mountain to this little orphanage there. So I think, I don't know if, I've come to learn that nothing happens without God's permission, and nothing surprises God. I don't know that God causes. I wouldn't go so far as to say God causes everything. So I don't know that God kept the gate closed and so that we couldn't catch that plane, or if we were just negligent and not getting there in time. But in any event, God used it for a purpose to get some supplies up to the Catholic priest. So that's a rabbit trail. So we got back to Charleston, and we said, because the name of the environmental company is General Engineering Laboratories, because General Engineering Labs was a Christian organization, it was completely within our culture to say, hey, here's a need, let's figure out how to respond to it. So we, just based on that trip to Honduras, we started another profit center. So there was the laboratory, there was engineering. We started another profit center to make water systems. And the idea was we'll send these water systems around the world. So we're learning that this problem isn't just in Honduras. This is a problem that exists in other places. And so for 2 years, from 98 to 2000, we built more water systems. We put more of them in Honduras. We responded to earthquake in El Salvador, flooding in Mozambique, an earthquake in Turkey. We were introduced to Samaritan's Purse, so we started partnering a little bit with Samaritan's Purse, but we were. It wasn't a good fit. It never really fit into the environmental business well. And in retrospect, looking back, I think God was using those 2 years to teach Molly and me about what today I call the global water crisis. And I gradually, I think both of us felt more satisfied when we were working on water projects than we were on dealing with environmental issues in the United States. 85% of our business had become government work. We were working for the Department of Energy and Department of Defense. And that's very bureaucratic work. And neither of us are bureaucrats. We're both pretty entrepreneurial. And so it just wasn't rewarding work. And so we agreed that it was the last Saturday in September of 2000. We agreed, let's sit on the back porch. Let's read and talk and pray and ask the Lord, what do you want us to do with our lives? We had 3 books that helped guide us through that day. The Bible, a book called Deep Change, which is actually a business book. It's about it's a business leadership book, and a book that y'all may be familiar with called Halftime. And Molly used to joke that a friend of hers had given her that book, and she had read it and thought it was a really good book, and told me that I should read it. And she said she put it on my bedside table, and it sat there for a year. I don't remember this, but she was adamant that this book sat on my side of the bed for a year. And I picked it up and read it, and the next week we're meeting to talk about what are we going to do with the rest of our lives. And that was the Saturday. So our halftime experience was a Saturday, the last Saturday in September of 2000. And by the time we got to the end of the day, we felt the Lord was saying, okay, I want you to shift and focus on bringing safe water to people. And that was a real turning point. It was a release. It was it was a celebration to get to that at the end of the day. Now, when you start a business, and y'all know about this, okay, it's fine to say, okay, let's shift gears. Okay, now you got to start dealing with the details. And we've been blessed to start 5 other businesses during the environmental business, so we knew about starting up businesses, and they were all related to environmental. They'd all spun off from the environmental company. So the first question was, is this a nonprofit organization or a for-profit organization? Well, 2 years trying to do it in a for-profit environment, that the answer to that question was pretty easy. There's a huge demand, but the problem is the people who need the water don't have the money, and so a good businessman would have realized that right off. It took us 2 years to figure out that this doesn't work in a for-profit environment. The next question is this a humanitarian organization? And these questions were being answered now over a period of probably a couple of months. Is this a humanitarian organization or is it a Christian ministry? Well, it's a Christian ministry because we're doing this because we feel the Lord's calling us to do it. I will tell you that knowing what I know today about the work that we're doing, God set us up to be a Christian ministry because humanitarian work without Jesus is not sustainable. I know that today, but I didn't know it then. So it was just again, how God kind of watches out for you and sets things up for you. So it's a Christian ministry. We had no experience in the nonprofit world, but we did know that there are kind of 2 schools of thought. Some ministries pay the people who work for them. And some ministries say, if you want to work for us, you need to raise your own funding. And right away, we knew that this was a big problem. The estimate, by the way, back then was that 1 billion people lacked access to safe water. And the statistics it's hard to get these statistics because, these are remote places where we're talking about. And so, but this was what the UN estimated, a billion people, and there were no estimates on the number of deaths from waterborne disease back then, but we knew that it killed people. So, recognizing that this is a serious problem, we knew we needed really good engineers in this organization. And a good engineer is not necessarily good at raising money for himself. And I wanted these engineers to be focused on water. So we're going to pay our people. And but we knew we couldn't afford to pay what they could be making if they were in a for-profit world. So from the beginning, we saw this as a calling. People who come and work at Water Mission, they're not looking for a job. They're here because they feel called, and they're prepared to earn less than they could earn if they were in a for-profit environment. Now, today, Water Mission does pay much better than we paid back in the original days, but still, it's not as much as people aren't here to earn a lot of money. They're here because God's called them here. So that was the beginning of what today we call Water Mission, and back then we called it Water Missions International, and it was officially formed. So we formed an LLC, and then we filed for a 501c3 status, which was a public charity, and we got IRS approval. I think it was 6 weeks. It was just really quick because there just was no question about it. I mean, we had good data that there's a need for this, and we had the ability to show that we had a solution. So the IRS approved our 501c3 status. Around that time, we realized we couldn't run an environmental business and run this ministry also. So we realized we needed to sell GEL. And I guess there were really two reasons that we realized we needed to sell. One, we couldn't run two companies, but also we realized we need money to start Water Mission, just like we needed it to start the engineering company. We need money to start Water Mission, and so it was around that time when one of our board members was working for Ron Blue. He was actually a childhood friend of Molly's, but he was working for Ron Blue. And he says, you really need to meet the people at Ron Blue. And so when we sold the company, Lloyd, I think you know Dan Grover. So we were introduced to Dan Grover, and he's our financial advisor to this day. He's just a great. He's on the board actually of Water Mission now, but he's a good friend, and so he helped us structure the sale, and I don't even remember what percentage of the sale we took and put into Water Mission, but it was enough to keep it going for 2 years. And it's kind of like starting up the environmental business. And the rest, Dan invested for us. And the idea was that, just kind of like the environmental business, once we get this thing up and going, and we build a donor base, then we'll start drawing a salary. But for the first 2 years, we said we won't draw a salary. We'll live off the savings. And the thought was, we really didn't need to have a big salary. We just make enough to kind of live on, because the kids were out of the house at that point. It's just Molly and me. And so we thought, well, when Water Mission gets up, we'll draw $50,000, and that'll pay for groceries. And we didn't have any debt. 2 years came, so now we're at 2003, and we don't have a donor base capable of supporting Water Mission, much less us. We're still building that. By the way, from the beginning, one of the first board meetings, we're sitting around. When you form an organization, you have to have a board for 501c3. So you get your friends around, and we're sitting around the table with our friends. And I have a gift for saying things that I wish I hadn't said the moment I've said them. And so I said to the board, Molly and I aren't fundraisers. And one of the board members pushed his chair back, and he says, well, we may as well close the door right now. because if you're not willing to ask people for money, nobody's going to be able to ask like you are. But fortunately, Molly's childhood friend broke the horns of the dilemma. He says, you don't have to ask for money. You can take a philanthropic approach and tell people that there's a problem. So, and this is the foundation for it. We now call it biblical stewardship, but this is the foundation for how Water Mission is funded. We introduce people to a problem. I told you that when we started, it was 1 billion people. Today, when we introduce people to the problem, the number is not 1 billion, it's 2 billion. It's a tragedy. And we do have statistics on deaths from waterborne disease. The estimate is that every day, 2,300 people die from a waterborne disease. And so I describe that problem as enormous because it's affecting 1/3 of the world's population, and it's urgent because as we're talking, people are dying. So my job is to tell people that there's a problem and to tell people that we have a solution to the problem and invite people to be a part. So it's not an ask, will you help me? It's here's an opportunity for you to be engaged in something that's really significant. And today Water Mission has a team of people who are excellent at telling that story and
yeah, shape up for our listeners, George, the scope of what Water Mission is now, and like kind of a soundbite numbers and scale, and then what you're most excited about when you look ahead in terms of bringing clean water, sanitation, and hygiene.
Yeah. So Water Mission's budget this year, I believe, is $36 million. It's become a big operation. We have 9 country programs. Actually, we have 8 country programs. Just 2 weeks ago, we had to close the program in Haiti because Haiti is just so chaotic. You can't work there. So I believe the numbers I saw, 600 staff around the world. About 150, I think, are here in the United States. And with COVID, we have learned that we can work virtually. So most of the staff is here in Charleston, but we do have people all over the country who are working virtually. But about 450, maybe 500 people are in these country programs. I think the estimate is that 8 million people are drinking safe water today from Water Mission projects. And there's actually, I saw a statistic on the website. Yeah, so this is all on the website. Over 8 million people, 3,000 projects, and we've done work in 60 countries. So we have staff in 8 countries, indigenous staff, and that was actually initially the strategy was that we would not have staff, or we would not have people in country. It was modeled after the environmental company where everybody was in one location because that's how we control quality. But the tsunami hit in 2004 And that really put Water Mission on the map. We ended up uh, in Indonesia and Sri Lanka, and we were partnering with other organizations, but we went in, that was the same year as the Gulf War. So we're working with Samaritan's Purse. George was in Afghanistan, and Molly and I went to Indonesia and Sri Lanka. And unfortunately, we found water systems that were sitting in a warehouse, hadn't been set up, or we found them on the side of the road not working because they hadn't been set up properly. And that's where we realized we've got to have people on the ground who know about water treatment. And initially, we tried to partner with other organizations, and we would, a couple of organizations, we funded a person that would be on that staff, but that didn't work. And so we ended up realizing we've got to have our own country program. So that's how we ended up with these indigenous staff.
George, if you've got the big picture, then we've got 600 people, 150 are in the US, 450 around the world in 60 different countries with 8 hubs, and a system where people have the impetus to maintain the equipment and to make sure it's delivered right. And it's not just clean water, but sanitation, hygiene, and the gospel go side by side. So when you think about that, just when you put your head, on your pillow at night, or when you have a quiet moment to just stop and think about this journey of hearing the voice of God, like these 3 big times and pivots along the way, right? From Exxon to learning in the lab, and taking the lab then and learning in the water crisis. And now really handing off the leadership of Water Mission to your son and focusing on this global water project. What are you learning that those of us who are following behind, that are maybe like Micah in their 40s and want to be the soil that produced 100-fold? What are you learning, as you look through those years and just see how God multiplied the kernel of faith that you took and just opening your hands like that?
Lloyd, for me, and what we're doing, we're working with people who are lack of safe water is not just an inconvenience, it's killing people. So there's a sense of urgency. You can't just sit around here and talk about, well, what do you want to do? You need to get out and do it. And what I've learned over the 23 years of in Water Mission is you don't get it right every time. But that shouldn't stop you from doing it. What Molly used to talk about, being in a blessable position. And what I've found is you have to, if you're going to lead an organization, you got to make decisions. And what I've found is if you pray about it, you make the right decision, then God blesses it. If you pray about it and you make the wrong decision, then God uses it as a learning experience, and He forgives. And so you're always moving forward. You even, I mean, we call them opportunities for improvement. We don't call it a mistake. We call it, put a positive spin on it. You have to surround yourself, you have to create a culture that attracts the best people. I mean, we're not looking for people who are out of work, can't find a job, and don't really want to work. We're looking for people who are talented and called, and and who feel a passion for people who are dying. Now, I'll tell you, the engineering side of what we do is the easy part. It's critically important, because if you don't design a tower right, it falls down. If you don't design a water system right, it doesn't remove the contaminants. You got to do that. And we have to design those and build them in such a way that they're going to last in a developing country. So we build to standards, to US standards. But the hard work is working with the people. That's where you're breaking generational paradigms here. This is where Jesus comes in. This is where there's a great book. There's a lot of books out there on misguided aid, especially in the water sector. The failure rate in this sector is 30%. At any given time, as I speak, 30% of water systems are not working. So one of the books that really transformed our thinking on how we do projects is called When Helping Hurts by Brian Fikkert. You're probably familiar with that book. There's another book that is the same principles, called Walking with the Poor by Bryant Meyer. Walking with the Poor is more a graduate level textbook, but it's excellent. But the bottom line is, when we talk about poverty in the West, we talk about it from a needs-based perspective. So I'm poor because I don't have money, or I don't have water, I don't have food, I don't have a house, I don't have an education, so forth. I don't have. The question, though, is why don't I have? And that gets down to what we call the root cause. And based on the principles of these two books I just mentioned, the root cause of poverty is found in dysfunctional relationships. And there are four. There's a spiritual relationship, there's a personal relationship with myself, a relationship with other people, and a relationship with the rest of God's creation. And so when we go into a project, we're going to go in and spend time understanding, how are these relationships doing in the community? Where are they thriving, and where are they not doing so well? And by the way, we all live in those relationships. So the really neat thing about the approach of Water Mission is that when we go into a community, we're going in as people who are living in those same four relationships. And oftentimes we learn a lot from the people in those communities. But the goal in community development is to build on what's working well and work towards healing in what's not working so well. And that's what community development is about. And that's how we avoid creating dependencies. The goal is to move communities to well-being. So, and you're right, you cannot deal with water without dealing with sanitation, with proper sanitation. What do you do with the waste? And you can't deal with all of that without dealing with hygiene. So the gospel, hygiene, sanitation, and safe water are all part of the package.
Thank you for listening to the 100X podcast. Please subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast service. We would greatly appreciate it if you could rate the show and leave us a review. This podcast is sponsored by Anchor Investments, whose mission is to build America's most generous real estate company. To learn more, please visit anchorinv.com.